Dynamic biblical discussions with special guests.
The day you embrace your African spirituality, your roots.
What I would encourage both scholars and people in our churches to do is to think about why some of these laws exist.
Well, classically, in Jewish and Muslim circles especially, the figure of Abraham, or Ibrahim in Arabic, is seen as really the father of monotheism, or to be more precise, the rediscoverer of monotheism.
When we say borders, what we mean is that people are not attaching themselves to a particular religious tradition that has boundaries.
It's the backdrop. It's the perfect cultural backdrop to set off in the strongest belief.
Exploring tough biblical issues.
But many people who start in one particular expression of Christian faith change over time.
You find a person who is half Christian and half African, not knowing what they're doing.
All right, just like these theologies that you've just alluded to, which are contextual theologies, eco-theology also falls within that that umbrella of contextual theologies.
I'll start by saying that my view of God has changed so much as I've gone on this journey. And growing up, I think I had what I would call sort of a traditional image of God. And some people jokingly will say that it's the sky daddy vision of God.
Sometimes it helps as Christians to see Christianity when we look at other religions, and then they can become a mirror that helps us see ourselves.
Academic scholarship, ethics.
Shafara Ani Vanessava, Black am I, and beautiful or lovely.
The thing I speak about most often is the hospitality of receiving.
And why this is important is that when we study cultures, in our case, particularly ancient cultures, literature and literary writings are some of the most important sources that we have.
We have a module in the history of Bible translation, so I'm very much interested in the history of Bible translation.
The basic idea of the contextual orientation is that we need to pay attention to what the Bible means in its original content.
Archaeology, textual criticism.
And so again, over and over again, when it says the Word of God, it's not referring to the Bible, it's referring to the gospel message. Jesus is the gospel message, the proclaimer and the one who embodies it, or it's referring specifically to Jesus as a person.
So these are the kinds of texts that were often held up, right? Some of these passages were often preached in settings in which the enslavers were attempting to keep the enslaved in their position, right?
I think you see a fair amount of Second Temple literature that I wouldn't say rejects the cult or rejects the priesthood, not at all, but it says, the priests we've got, you priests, shape up.
Is this Christianity really anything to do with Jesus Christ? Or is this Christianity simply a spiritual justification for white supremacy?
But I also think that if you look at the history of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam for that matter, you can find that both immortality and resurrection are there.
Baptism actually freed us from the terms of that covenant and made us a son of God rather than a son of the evil powers of the world.
I think reality is much more complicated now, especially textual reality, where so much of the tradition comes from the reading of previous texts, the rereading of previous texts.
Old Testament, New Testament Bible interpretation.
Domination is how we have typically seen dominion. And I understand how we get that twisted because we get it wrong. Because in the text, the actual word is rada.
So whereas the Old Testament points directly to Jesus, the Tanakh in Judaism actually points this way and backwards and forwards. It's got multiple meanings rather than just one focus meaning.
People from the two different religious groups are speaking to each other. We indeed are using the same word, the same two words, the Bible coming from the Greek via the Latin, but we mean a very, very different collection of texts. And we have to remember that.
If we limit the text just to one meaning, which is sometimes what Christians will do with the Old Testament, it all points to Jesus. Every single verse points to Jesus, and that's it.
Christianity has been damaged, Pastor Cliff, in South Africa. I think it's been severely damaged.
So one of the great things about archaeology is that as archaeologists, we dig up not just palaces and temples and big buildings, but we dig up the remains associated with everybody else in the population.
Apocalyptic literature.
I think for interfaith families, often the challenge is coming primarily from outside the family.
My intention was simply to understand how do we make shalom and what are we looking at here.
Okay, so it's important for me to say that. So Reconstruction theology is a very interesting theology. It's a theology that has been criticized a lot.
Authoritarian is essentially a top-down approach from the people in our lives who actually wield the text as a tool of destruction.
Christian history, ancient Near East cultures.
Now, as far as an understanding of Black liberation theology, I usually approach it this way. I look at the three terms in the phrase Black liberation theology, and we'll find that for us, liberation is the key, and liberation means the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Do I think that Jesus is really coming back? I mean, honestly, no, I don't.
There are imbalances in the world that I live in. There are problems. They're asking such questions as, why does discrimination exist? Why are some people poor and others not poor and others even rich? Things like that. Asking questions about power, asking questions about society. That's the personal connection for me.
If the church isn't living out that orthodoxy and that orthopraxy is one thing, well then there's no example, there's no model for people coming out of fundamentalism to implement.
You're tuned in to Conversations with Pastor Cliff on Puluso Ministries.